Well, in round number 30. So. Yeah. I've worked with a local design firm.
Hello, friends, and welcome. My name is Roger Jackson. I'm the chapter president of the Utah chapter of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. I'm to welcome you tonight. Our host today is Micah Christensen. And Micah's going to come up and talk briefly and tell us a little bit about what's happening here.
Great. Are we getting a little feedback?
Yep.
Can you hear it? Okay, I'm going to see if I can change that by magic of moving this.
Yeah. And I don't have to bring
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Welcome. So my name is Micah Christensen. I am the, boy, it's the first time I've ever said this. I'm the director of the Salt Lake Art Museum. So, this, you are the inaugural event in what will be a museum that opens up next year. It will be the first new art museum in Salt Lake since 1984. And just to give you a quick statistic, I was one of the authors of the Dictionary of Utah Fine Artists, which tried to document the biographies of 4,500 artists living and historic in Utah. I wrote about 900 of those biographies. And in the process, we found out that Utah has the most artists per capita of any state in the union. However, we have the second fewest museums, second only to West Virginia. So the purpose of this museum will be to close that gap. And we hope that our partnership with the ICAA and with other organizations, if you're interested, will want to come here and hold great discussions like the one we're having tonight that celebrate local artists, architects, and the culture that makes Utah art. So thank you for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Micah. This event tonight is the maiden voyage of the Salt Lake Art Museum, so we're happy to be here. I'd like to also thank CRSA Architects to help sponsor tonight. They are the founder of the Beast, and please don't be shy and eat some or I'll have to take it all home. We have future events planned with the Utah chapter. In February, we have an event, a classical workshop that will be held down at UVU, and you can register for that online. And we also have an event with a man named Philip Smith, who's an architect from Charleston, South Carolina, is an instructor at the American College of Building Arts. And he's going to give a lecture about the influence of Black architects on the historic architecture of Charleston, which should be really, really interesting. So I'm looking forward to that. Housekeeping wise, I've got a little sign up sheet. I would dearly love it if y'all would sign up. And if you don't want us to pester you, don't check the box that says, can we pester you? But I do need to know, because I have to report how many people came tonight. And I'm so thrilled with the turnout. This is just spectacular. I think I have a little fact sheet in the entryway about what is the ICAA and what do we do and how you can join and how you can contribute to us. So if you want to pick that up on your way, you can. Please feel free to grab some snacks. I'm so happy to have my friend Alan speak to us tonight. Alan is a treasure in this state and one of the most important architects from the state of Utah. We should have highway patrolmen around him to protect and guard him. He's a dear friend. We were competitors all the time, and I would see the list of people going after the jobs that we were chasing, and I'd see Alan's name and go, why? Because Alan will get the job. He's just a master. He's a genius. He's a sweet man. And I love him as a friend and a brother. We're just so happy to have him. He knows everything. And we're happy to have him. So, Alan,
I think Roger is the master of hyperbole. Thanks for your generous introduction. I too co-own an art gallery, Charlie Art and Antique, over at Charlie Square. And in addition to the stats that we just heard, It's been a rough few years since COVID, and I think Utah also has the lowest per capita purchasing of art. But this kind of operation, a new museum, that's a great way to expose greater part of the population to our art world here. One of the curious things about being a speaker at an event like this is I get to watch all of you eat while I talk. About 8 years ago, I met Nan Weber. Would you stand up and take a bow? And Nan and I both found that we each had a strong interest in Richard Kletting and his work. And because of the Fisher Mansion on 12th West and 2nd South. And I had been doing National Register nominations of Kletting buildings with the State Historical Society. So we decided very quickly to take on the task of writing a book about Kletting. So we've been working on this for 8 years, doing deep diving research. When we started, I think we knew about 20 of Kletting's prominent buildings. And we have now documented over 450 Kletting projects, 180 of which are houses, 127 of which are still standing. Amazingly, it's an amazing percentage because the competing architects at the time, some of which were very prolific, their buildings are not here anymore. And yet many of his buildings are still here. So I'm here to talk about Kletting and his classical architecture. He was really a master of all the architectural styles in vogue during his period. And that would be from 1883 when he came to Utah and through 1943 when he was killed walking home, run over by a car, although he had retired long before that. So let us begin. Richard Kletting did not design this building, but he could have. This is a 2,000-plus-year-old temple in Nimes, France, Maison Carrée, and it's one of the most intact of all the early classical buildings. This is from the Greco-Roman period, which started really about 500 BCE in Greece, and then in Rome about 300 CE or AD, and it evolved gradually over those centuries. So Richard Kletting did this building. And some people claim, in fact, I read an article, a 1914 article that compared the state capitol with a Parthenon. It's kind of a stretch, but you can see the similarities. When we think of classical architecture, I think those of us, especially trained in architecture, immediately think back to that Greco and Roman period, and we think of the orders we all had to learn in architectural school. I used to call this the Ironic order, but it's the Ionic order, and it's just one of the Greek orders. And here you see the evolution of columns. You have on the left the short, stocky, strong Tuscan and Doric columns, and then you move toward the middle and you see the taller, elegantly and harmonically combined elements of the Ionic column, and then to the far right, the even taller and flamboyantly ornamental Corinthian columns. And of course, beyond that, there are composite columns and capitals, and Kletting himself designed a number of unique capitals and columns in some of his buildings. And so we think stereotypically of classical architecture as being something like this, but it evolved and it ended up becoming many other things. I think it's important to begin as sort of a context to understand what are, and it's not just architecture, it's fine art, sculpture, painting, even music, and other kinds of cultural manifestation. It's not a particular specific style. It's a way of thinking. It's a way taking the elements of architecture and ordering them in a certain pleasing way. We have classical architecture in the Arab countries, in the Islamic countries. The Egyptians, they had their own columns and capitals and other elements that are parallel to the Greco-Roman ones. And probably the most famous early quote is from Vitruvius. You see it here: buildings should embody strength, unity, and beauty. And by utility, I think he meant functionality. There's another quote, I won't read it, you can read it. And then we have all of the post-Greco-Roman styles. And these are essentially fusions of Greek and Roman elements, along with enhanced and expanded and re-imaged forms and methods of ornamentation. So here are some of the styles that emerged from the early classicism. I won't read them, you can read them. In Utah, the one that was most dominant was the Greek Revival. The other ones predate that, and after Greek Revival, they postdate it. So here are three images. You see on the left, a simple chaste Doric column or Tuscan column building. To the right, you have a similar but bigger building, and now we have sculpture and wreaths and more ornamental elements. And then finally at the bottom, you have something that looks nothing like the ones above. There's not a triangular pediment. We have 2 stories, we have a flat roof. And so you see that over the centuries, not only were temples done by the Greeks and Romans, but they did all kinds of other buildings, which were also classical, which we rarely see images of. And then you get into the very flamboyant expressions, the Italian Renaissance, the Rococo, the Baroque, and Beaux-Arts, where they really take it to the nth degree, and yet it's still a form of classicism. And another example, a typical of public buildings, libraries, courthouses, and those kinds of structures. If you go to Washington, D.C., you'll see the whole campus of the governmental buildings. Most of those are neoclassical or some version of that. So Richard Kletting, he was, I would say, a genius, a prodigy when he was young, a most accomplished person in everything he tried to do, and he tried to do everything. And I'll talk about him as a Renaissance man at the very end. He was born in 1858 in a small German town. His father was an engineer while he was still in his teens. He was educated by tutors because his family moved a lot and they didn't have the stability to have him go to schools. So they hired tutors, and he was interested early on in engineering and then architecture. His school books are still extant, and they're full of sketches of classical buildings, floor plans, elevations. He died, as I mentioned, in 1943, and retired basically at the end of the state capitol project, which completed in 1916. The first project that we know that he worked on is this church in Lauterach, Austria, and we're not sure exactly what his role was, although apparently it was significant. He had already won awards while he was in the military for his drafting and design. And he had worked with a city planning company in Austria or in Germany when he was still in his late teens. This building has an interesting, let's see, try this. How about that? This little element right here, the stepped fascia, you're going to see this in some of his early Utah buildings. So I don't know if he was the designer or worked as a draftsman for the designer, but this was his first known project. So the next 3 projects are really significant, and they set a precedent for his knowledge gathering of classicism. The building on the upper left is a bank, one of the major banks. Parisian architects on that building, this building here, and you can see the classicism all through the building. It's French Second Empire. In fact, it was all of this was French Second Empire architecture under Napoleon III during the 1870s and 80s. And that was his in the field training. The Bon Marché, you've heard of this. I've actually gone to this building and I photographed the trusses, the steel trusses on the top floor. And Kletting became a pioneer of steel truss roofing systems and domes in Utah after he arrived. And then he worked as a draftsman for an architect on the Sacré-Cœur, this beautiful monumental building with its spectacular domes. He was one of the draftsmen who did the working drawings for the dome construction on that building. So all of this he did in his young 20s before he left Germany and came to Utah in the middle of 1883. In Utah, he found that Salt Lake was an emerging Victorian city of brick and stone. But outside of Salt Lake City, the towns, cities were just finishing a 30-year period of Greek Revival architecture. The Greek Revival in a very simple, modest, chaste form. This is the best example of it that's still existing, the Bountiful Tabernacle with its portico, its columns, its tower, 1857 to 1862, so very early, and it was saved from demolition in the 1970s. It was one of my first preservation attempts, and there's a whole story behind it, but it's still standing today. But the other Greek Revival buildings were even simpler. Basically boxes, rectangular plans. They had low to medium pitched roofs and cornice returns. They all had these cornice returns. And that was pretty much as far as it went in terms of classicism. They were symmetrical, they were durable, they are stately, but they're not full-fledged portico type Greek Revival or classical architecture. Here are some others. The best commercial building in this style is the Ephraim Co-op that's still standing in Sanpete County. These other three buildings are all gone: the Provo Tabernacle, Weber County Courthouse, and Brigham Young School. But you can see again the Greek Revival elements in all of these buildings. So that's what he found in terms of non-residential architecture. And then we have the residences. There are still thousands of these Greek Revival homes throughout Utah, especially in the rural towns. And you can see the same elements, the Greek Revival cornice returns. The houses tended to have the broad sides face the street, whereas churches, schools, commercial buildings tended to have the gable end face the street, like this one here. And during Kletting's career, there were other architects who created classical architecture. Here are a couple of examples. There are some others. His peers did this, but during the early decades when he was here, the 80s and early 90s, really it was a Victorian period of time. So his classical architecture mainly was at the end of his career. Here's another one, Utah County Courthouse. The ionic columns, triangular pediment and statuary, symmetrical, early 1920s. So there were three ways that Richard Kletting implemented classicism in his architecture, his non-Victorian architecture. And I could do a whole lecture just on his Victorian buildings because they were really quite spectacular. The first one was buildings of no classical style employed classical principles like really good proportions, symmetry, durability, and some of those other characteristics we saw earlier. The second one is also buildings not of classical style. Some were modern buildings or buildings of any style, but he applied classical elements to them. See the photographs. Many other classical elements were applied to these otherwise stylistically disparate buildings. And the third category would be this one. That's the Salt Palace. The state capitol fits into that category as well. This is the revival of Greco-Roman classicism. And that would be toward the end of his career, as I mentioned, these buildings came forward. Kletting, when he first arrived, was hired the day after he got here by John Haven Burton. And together they worked on the Desert University, which was a huge building on a large campus, and the Territorial Insane Asylum in Provo, a gigantic structure, maybe the largest in the territory at the time. This was before Utah was a state. And he must have been uncertain about what his career would do. So he started this night school, and it ran for many years. And you'll see there are 16 topics, and he taught 10 of them. He taught all the arithmetic and math classes. He taught the drawing classes. He taught the geography and natural history and chemistry classes. And he taught the language classes. And then it says, if required, history of architecture. So at age 25, he had his own school teaching all of these classes, and he was knowledgeable in all of these subjects. One of his first projects was stone carving, and this is the house of eventual Governor Thomas, and Kletting did the carved, these are lion faces, I think, the keystones and some of the other carved elements. But stone carving isn't what he wanted to do, really. He really wanted to be a full-time architect, and within months, he had rented an office space, put his name in the directory as an architect, and started to gather clients. So the first decade or so, he did virtually no classical architecture. I'm just going to give you some teasers. These are some of his homes, and they're all versions of Victorian styles. You've got Victorian Romanesque, and you've got Queen Anne, and you've got shingle style, and all the other subtypes of Victorian architecture. He loved towers, and there's one, and there's one, and there's a bunch, and here's one. In fact, the top of this one, curiously, is identical to the top of the towers of the Logan Temple. And that's because the house was done for John W. Taylor, an apostle in the LDS Church. And so you get that. Here are some others. You can see the variety of forms and textures and the polychromatic color schemes. And everyone was different. He didn't plagiarize himself. So his first decade was doing Victorian buildings. And of course, in addition to houses, he did commercial buildings. He did 20-some schools, many other kinds of buildings, not in classical style. Here's John Haven Burton. Here's the first project they worked on, which was a railroad depot, and it's Hudson Bay Gothic, basically. There's a title for this kind of depot. It's not classical, except for the symmetry and again, the monumentality of it as a railroad depot in 1884. So that's their early project. Unfortunately, John Haven Burton was murdered in 1887. And so Kletting took over his projects, plus he had his own projects, plus he was trying to get new projects. So he was very busy. In 1888, I think he had 38 projects with himself and a couple of draftsmen. This is one of them. This is the Territorial Insane Asylum. He was brought into this project while Burton was still alive. This was at the end of Center Street in Provo. And here's the center section right here. So it's definitely Victorian, and yet it has a classical composition in terms of the front of the building. His first school was not in Utah. Somehow he landed this job in Wyoming. It was 1886, the Halleck School. It sat on a hill overlooking the town. And it is symmetrical on all of the facades. Here's that stepped gable element again. There are some sort of classical elements, the rondelle, the Roman arches, these just subtly introducing some of those elements into otherwise Victorian designs. This is the wonderful but ill-fated Dooley building. He designed this with Sullivan and Advent, the famous architects from Chicago. Sullivan apparently did the basic design and the first couple of floor plans, and then the upper floors were not designed. So Kletting was brought in. He did the upper floors, but he also did the construction documents, the renderings, and really the lion's share of the work. Although if you read a biography of Sullivan, you'll see Kletting not named at all. But this facade is a classical facade. It has no classical ornament at all, but it has wonderful classical principles behind it. Again, classicism is a way of thinking with certain concepts, not a specific style. Of course, Kletting was very famous for probably the most fantastical and colorful and curious resort, waterside resort, other than Coney Island, which he visited in the country, and as large really as Coney Island. Saltair, the original Saltair. You can see this is the pavilion building. And it's symmetrical. This is a classical building. It's classical Moorish or Moroccan or what are all of these styles and ornaments? It's definitely not Greco-Roman. See, we didn't include the Sanborn map on that. We should have, because this was just one of, I don't know, 20 or 30 buildings that was part of this complex. Unfortunately, it burned down in the 1920s, and then it was decided to rebuild it. And so they used Kletting's plans to do the second version of it, which looked very much like the first. And then it burned down in the 1970s. And I think I was the last person to get to see it, because I moved to Salt Lake just before that and drove out there. The door was open. And so I got to go all through the building, and it was amazing. 1,114 feet long, 165 feet wide, no columns. That was Kletting. That was his specialty, clear spanning truss structures. Okay. This was the Territorial Exposition Building. This is before there was a state fair, and it's on the site of where Trolley Square is now. It was built in 91 through 92, 3. The towers were built later and included a grandstand and some other structures. And unfortunately, it was torn down when Trolley Square was built, so it only existed for about 16 years. But again, you can see the symmetry, the grandeur, the big fan light, the Roman arched windows, and it's not Greco-Roman at all. It's a, I don't know, Queen Anne or some other Victorian style. And this little brewery that he did in Evanston, Green River, is still standing. And it again is castellated like the Salt Lake Brewery, which he was also the architect of. There are some classical elements right in here, some finials and a vase. So there are some attempts to classify it, but it definitely is a different style, a rusticated Romanesque kind of a style. And then you have the first 4 buildings at the University of Utah. He designed all 4 of them, Widtsoe and Emory, Cowles, and so forth. But because of a disagreement over a fee, he didn't get paid for the 4th building because they didn't build it. The clients somehow thought that if they didn't build it, they didn't have to pay him for all the work he did to design it. Clients today, some of them still have that idea. Anyway, it's a second Renaissance revival. It's kind of an Italian influenced revival. And you've got these beautiful arches, these interesting elements up in here that are kind of cartouches, the bracketed cornice or eaves rather. All of these buildings have classicism embodied in their exteriors. And he designed all of the Rocky Mountain Bell telephone buildings in Utah, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming. These are just 2 of them in Butte and Boise. Classical elements here, dentals and classicism up in here. the bell icon or symbol in there. And I think these are the last two in this, what I'm calling type one. The home insurance building and the Fisher Brewery. Well, this is pure prairie style, but it's symmetrical, that facade, that facade. It's a small building, it's gone now, 1912. And yet, and again, it shows his adaptability going from early Victorian buildings to classical buildings to prairie style buildings, all of those styles he was able to master. He had a vast library. One of his early jobs was to catalog and reorganize the territorial library. He wasn't a librarian, but he was so literate that they hired him to redo the library. He also renumbered the streets in Salt Lake. Is this building classical? It looks almost modern, but it was that era right there at the end of his career. And so it doesn't have classical detailing, but it has classical principles behind the composition. And then bridge design, right after he'd retired, actually, he got involved in a number of committees, zoning committee, arts committee, just about any kind of committee that had public improvements. And he designed this bridge that was supposed to go over Parley's Canyon. It was a competition, and he lost the competition, but the bridge was never built. And he wanted to build another bridge spanning Memory Grove that would go from the avenues over to the Capitol Block. But you can see the classicism in this bridge design. Type two, this would be other architectural styles upon which he applied classical detailing. So this building put it on the map in a way. This was the pavilion out at Lake Park, and now it's in Lagoon. It's still extant. And a lot of people went to the park and they got to see this building, and Kletting was known from the beginning as having designed it. And here you can see the classicism built into the design of this really fabulous flamboyant pavilion. And so this was 1886. It was only a couple of years after we arrived here. Then you have the great Cullen building. This might have been the state's first 5-story building. Here's a rendering of it. You can see the closeness between the rendering and the finished product. But it had ionic columns for the canopy, brackets, all of these classical design motifs. And you've got the scroll at the top with the cartouche and the finials, and classical, symmetrical and well-proportioned facade. This is a great example of this type 2 classicism of his. He did 3 Romanesque revival buildings, only one of which still stands. The 2 that do not survive are these 2, the Hooper block and the Board of Trade block. Again, you can see the classicism, the columns, the Roman arches, keystones, finials, these bosses and capitals all the way up through the dentils. Same with the other building. This has an interesting polygonal cantilever set of bay windows, these 2 stories here that come out toward the street. Unfortunately, these buildings have not survived, but they're good examples of type 2. This is the Equitable block. It sat on a corner. He liked doing Orioles, which are projections off the corner. And you can see classical elements all through this part of the building, especially. And then the Carrick building, this still stands on South Main Street between 2nd and 3rd South on the west side. This is his rendering. And you can see that the finished building is pretty close to that, not the first floor. And I'm not sure it was ever actually built that way, but you can see the balconettes and these elements here. You can see the cornice and finials. We have some details. This has been restored in the last 10 or 20 years, and it was painted and all the elements were missing, and the owner put them all back. You can see the classical detailing. This building on the left was the Deaf and Dumb Building, which sat on the campus of the Desert University where West High School is. It's a large building. It has classical elements applied to it. It has been gone for a long time. It used to be also called the Union School. And then somehow Richard Kletting, despite being a German immigrant with a strong accent, a beer swilling, pipe smoking Gentile, he got a lot of projects from the LDS Church. In fact, more than the other LDS architects at the time. In fact, maybe more than all of them together. He did all of the Brigham Young Trust Company buildings, such as this one. There were about a half a dozen of those. He did some churches, tabernacles. Saltair was actually built and paid for by the LDS Church. So he because of his expertise, his knowledge, his mastery, he was trusted to take on these challenging projects, and you can see the result. In 1883, the Second Empire Courthouse was designed and built by Obed Taylor. And in about 1889, it burned down. Actually, all of this part burned. The walls were still standing. And so Kletting was hired to reconstruct and renovate and build anew the whole upper part of this building. And you can see he changed the style. He used classical motifs in the dormers and the tower and the interior, the beams and the woodworking and so forth. So he used classicism to upgrade this fire gutted building. He did these two courthouses, the one in Nephi, the one in Ridgefield, probably off the same floor plan, and they're symmetrical. They have Roman arches, they have columns, they have a number of classical details. This one may be better proportioned than this one. This one still exists. This one's long gone. Still standing next to the, is it Eccles Grand Theater? To the east of it is this brownstone building with red sandstone. This is Kletting's rendering of the elevation. This is the finished building. It still looks pretty much like this. There are lots of classical elements throughout this facade, this wonderful entry, and you have the foliated scrolls and the beautiful archway. A lot of the weathering has removed some of the ornament, but they were able to save it while building this gigantic building next door. It's on the National Register, as are many of his other buildings. The Dinwiddie block, it seemed like he couldn't decide floor by floor which way to go, flat arched windows for Romaner. So he alternated, you know, all the way up to the top. And it says 1890. This building still exists on First South between Main Street and West Temple. On the south side, it's got a flat, plain, blank facade. And this is behind it. All of this is behind it. And it's unfortunate that flat facade is there. I wish they would take it off and reveal this facade here. This is the Whittingham block. This is one of my first failed attempts at preservation. Tried to save this building. It's another one of the Brigham Young Trust Company buildings. And it's got lovely metal work up here. Brigham Young Trust Company, Whittingham, arch, and classical motifs applied to the facade all the way through here. This building was destroyed in the late 70s. The Springville Bank, and I understand FFKR has now been appointed to restore this bank. This also has been covered with a plain facade that's just like a blank sheet of paper on both sides. The tower is gone, and they just covered over everything else. This is a detail, but it's got classicism and its detailings all through the facade. It's really quite wonderful. It was wonderful, and now they've been tasked with restoring it back to its original appearance, either with a reconstruction or restoring the existing building and maybe getting the tax credits. Right across the street is the Reynolds block. It's slightly Sullivan-esque, maybe Victorian Romanesque. design that are not any of the Greco-Roman type, but they are similar. And you see more ornamental classicism in the upper part of the building as well. This is still standing. The Clausen building, this narrow building on South Main, it looks pretty simple, but when you start looking at the details, you start picking up these kinds of motifs, which were added to the building to give it a visual relief, so that it wasn't just a flat facade. Something to look at, something to marvel at. He did the downtown Salt Lake Rocky Mountain Bell building. This is the original building. Then he added these two bays here, keeping it symmetrical, keeping the details intact. And then he added two more floors at the top here, using this this kind of carved stone icons representing the Bell Company. And Ochre School, some people think William Carroll designed Ochre School, but actually Kletting did, and he is documented as having been paid for it, but so was Carroll. So it looks like Carroll took on the project. He had worked with Kletting before on earlier projects. Carroll and Kern, their firm split apart after getting this job, so all of a sudden Carroll was without his staff. So it looks like Kletting and Carroll together did this building. Sumner School was another version of this building, and it's wonderfully classical, symmetrical Roman arches. This detailing is quite nice, and these new gates are, I think, very compatible with the architecture of the school. The very interesting comparison here. This is his rendering for the Deseret News Building. It's got a lot of ornamentation, these light posts, and you can just see it's sort of Victorian in character. But when he finally does the building, it's a lot more like the Dooley building. It's really flat, smooth stone for the most part. There are dentils, and there's one part of the building right here where he decides to add the classicism. You can see the entry. You can see the reflection of the Salt Lake Temple in the transit. And you've got this cartouche and these severe-looking faces staring out at you at the entry. This is a poor photo, and we don't have a picture of the building, but this was his design for a photographic studio, and it had these big windows across this area. But there are all of these classical elements up and through here, along in here, here, down in here. So it was a modern building in a way, but classicist in its relief and its detailing. Then you have the New Yorker. You'd say, well, that's mission style, or that's Spanish colonial revival. And it's got a big flat facade. But if you the portico here has ionic columns, and if we go forward, you'll see classical elements in here, and then he put these metal cartouches at the far ends of the building, and some other details like that. So he just can't help himself. No matter how modern he's trying to be, he's got to have some classicism added in. The Feld building you recognize as being on about 3rd South Main. This is his blueprint for the building. It's symmetrical, it's terracotta, it's basically Sullivan-esque with the piers going up and then coming back down. But look at the detailing. You've got these classical figures in terracotta in all of the arches, and then these stylized capitals. And you've got a face and a campus lead, and you've got egg and dart and a beaded band. You've got all kinds of classicism added to this building very subtly. It's monochromatic, like most classical buildings. It looks modern in a way, and yet there's a lot of classicism here. The Jefferson School, this is one of his concrete buildings before anybody else was doing concrete schools. And it's symmetrical. It has a lot of detailing that's classical. And I remember this building, and it was torn down, I don't know, 30 years ago. But it's kind of a modern building with classical elements. And this looks almost like continuous bands of windows with crops. And from here down, it looks pretty modern. And then you have the dentals and this kind of ornament here, medallions. And so again, it's a modern building, but it gives honor to past generations of classicist architects and detailing. And then there's this one, the McIntyre building. It's still standing too, another National Register site. This was his clay model. Notice what he intended to do originally. A curved top, all of this fancy textured classicism here. And when he finally gets done, it's a copy of the Gage building in Chicago, almost identical to it. But again, he can't do a building that's just flat and plain and austere and sterile. It's got to add some visual interest. So you see classicism introduced in different areas. Maybe you've never noticed this. The thing is, if you're an architectural historian, you have to look up. Because most first stories are altered, but the upper stories, you'll find this interesting material, and it's all still there. It was what he called a fireproof building, fire resistant. That was one of his big selling points. He believed strongly in fire resistant construction, and it was part of his pitch to clients, because 3 of his offices had burned, had caught on fire, and he had lost architectural drawings and equipment. And so he was a huge fan of fire resistant steel, concrete, stone, but nothing that can burn. This is a little co-op store in Lehigh. It's just a little brick building, Roman arch, but it's still standing, and this is what is at the top. These lion heads, this cartouche, this scroll, again, classicism. And finally, we have the Salt Lake Brewing Company. This building is still standing as well. This is an early photo. This is a recent photo. It's almost identical. You've got the heavily dental cornice. We've got these polygonal bay windows, a little bit of classicism up in here. 19th, so we're well into the modern period now. And he recognizes that, and he wants to design that way. That's what's in vogue. But he has classicism in almost everything. This is a chateau-esque style house, probably the best one in Utah. It's vacant right now, in danger. The yard as well, everything kind of deteriorating. But even though it has a multiplicity of forms, it has lots of classicism. The detailing you can see right in here, and it's falling off now, unfortunately. Stone carving, classical windows with stone carving. He loved stained glass. All of his buildings, houses and Victorian buildings, all of them had stained glass. I could give a whole lecture just on his stained glass creations and his cartouches. And I wish somebody would purchase this and save it. Micah, where are you? Yeah, save it. This is the Armstrong Mansion you recognize on 7th East and 1st South. It was started by Kletting. Then Armstrong, the mayor, couldn't afford to do it. And so there was a hiatus. And then William Ward became the architect. He was one of the early architects on the Salt Lake Temple. Couldn't agree with Brigham Young and Truman Angell on some things. And so he left Utah back 30 years later and was involved in designing this, and then he left, and then Kletting ended up designing. So interesting Victorian building, but look at the warm classical kinds of interior woodworking to make this a wonderful home interior. This is Reed Smoot's house, the Senator Smoot, and it's in Provo, and this is a picture right after it was built. There's Smoot and his family and the fence. And we took a photo from the same exact spot. You can see it's pretty much intact other than the paint, but it has a number of classical elements. It's actually symmetrical. And one of the things that Kletting pioneered is projecting 45-degree angle bay. He didn't like dead corners like this one over here. Taking a corner and extending it out and creating a sitting room or a study. right there. Here's some of the detailing. This is on the National Register as well. He loved these eyebrow windows. If you drive through the avenues, you'll see a number of these. And then the Fisher Mansion. The Friends of the Fisher Mansion are working with the city and others, neighborhood council, etc., to restore the building. It's boarded up now, but it's Italian Renaissance revival. But it had a number of classical elements in it, as you'll see from some of these details. And this is a house I used to own down in Spring City. And here's a Mormon house type with the cornice returns from the 1870s, maybe early 80s. And then there's a Kletting-esque tower, identical of his others in Salt Lake. And here's a classical portico, which was added in 1896, not by Kletting probably, but by his protege, Richard C. Watkins, who took over his Provo office in 1891. Now we have the third category, which is basically Greco-Roman inspired classicism revived. The first one is the Continental Market. This had two facades like this. It was an L-shaped plan, so one faced one street and one faced the other. You can see how small these guys are. The scale of this is quite nice. I mean, this stand light is about 3 persons high, and you see these interesting cartouche-like finials and other types of classical elements throughout this facade. Now he's in the later part of his career, so we're going to see more classical classicism. This is the Losi Jewelry Building in Provo. I'm just going to point out some of the elements of classicism, the swags, the wreaths, the fancy fascia, the corbelled or dentile cornice, eaves on the windows. It's just a small building, a little jewelry store. It's replete with classicism. This is his most interesting projects, I think. The Riverton Meeting House. This is elevation. You can see that they decided to come into the building, so that's not reflected here. But this is probably Beaux-Art, I would say, is probably the way to describe this building. And let's look at some of the details. If you blow up the upper level, you see these just fabulous and interesting finials. This round window that is also on some of his houses. This pediment here, the transoms with interesting glass. Lots of classical thought went into this building. Unfortunately, it was torn down, but a replica of it has been built in Riverton. Replica of the not these. The Clallam Building. It's standing on South Main next to the Carrick Building, and it's neoclassical, symmetrical facade, Roman arches, medallions, stylized Ionic capitals on one side and some on the other, and the egg and dart and beaded band dentils. Small facade, chaste, simple, elegant, monochromatic, nice example of commercial classicism. And then you have the spectacular Salt Palace. Unfortunately, it burned down after only 9 years. It was very short-lived. And as he perceived it, initially these great towers, kind of like the Insane Asylum and the Territorial Fair building, these never got built, but this part did. And because it was a salt palace, he came up with the idea of going out to the Great Salt Lake, having giant blocks of salt cut out of the land out there and brought back and ground up. And so the whole outside of the building was covered with salt, which glistened in the sun. Think Kirtland Temple and the broken glass example. And inside, he did the same thing. The interior walls and ornamentation, all covered with salt crystal, which when you shine lights on it, it would kind of glisten. And so here's the interior. You can see the brackets. You can see all the classical ornament everywhere. And here, in between the ribs of the dome, Nebraska, Dakota, Nevada. And so all around the interior of the dome, you have this ornamentation honoring the different states of the Union. And here is a beautiful postcard. For the back of the building, you have this wraparound porch element. You can see all the classicism up through the top of the building, and then this reflection pond. Like again, by 1910, it was gone. It's gone. Richard Kletting designed the buildings at the University of Deseret campus where West High is. And he continued to be hired by the regents of the state by this time, actually, yeah, 1896. In 1890, he did this master plan for the U of U campus. This little building here is still there. It's the boiler plant. And these four buildings he designed, this one, and these two, these four, and the park building ended up here. So you can see the symmetrical plan, a president's circle, a drive, and then all the other buildings on this side, the buildings on that side. As the next slide shows, it didn't quite work out that way. You have his four buildings here, park building, and then they decided to bring two roads down this way instead of down the center. You still see the circle. And then it's skitty-wumpus dropping in of buildings after that, not relying on classicism for the site plan. Here is these features. Here we have his stylized Corinthian columns. And here we have the capitals. And then we have these. And what are these? These look like stone versions of some mechanical device. Maybe this was an engineering building. This kind of stuff is his version of modern classicism that is unrelated to that. Love the wood. In fact, FFKR restored that building. This is a doctor's house, Georgia Revival. There's a lot of classical elements in the rendering. There are not so many when you look at the actual straight here is gone, for example, and some of the elements are missing. Now Odyssey House has this building. There's a new building in front of this. The interior, ionic columns in the fireplace mantle. Usually those were ordered through Sears and Roebuck catalogs and just shipped out, but every once in a while the interiors would be classical as well. This is the Federation of Labor building. There's this east elevation. You can see it here. See classicism in the facade. That building is still on the corner of 4th South and State Street. This was added when it became the Plandome Hotel. And then let's look at some of the details. These cherubs hanging a cartouche up here. And these elements at the corner, and this on the facade. This 1903 has been taken off, as has all the other classical detailing. And this is missing too. So the building are declassified, let's call it. Brigham Young Trust Company is a Calder music company. It had a musical lyre here and some other classical features, plus the symmetry, of course. This was the Hoff building in the 1860s. I think Folsom designed this. And it's classical in its own right, but he was commissioned to give it a new facade. So here is his rendering of the elevation. And here it is. And you can see the classical elements into here, other areas. And here are some details, the bird, all the lion, all of this stuff. He loved drawing classical detailing. He just loved it. And then he added this top floor later on, and it's more traditional in some ways, yet it has columns and Roman arches. The Wall Mansion, this was the original building, the Sharp Mansion, 1884, Italian Victorian. And then this is Kletting's rendering of what he was going to change it to. So he stripped off this element. He covered the front of the building with this. He added this to the back, added this to the side. He took out all the wood floors and wood reinforced concrete floors and roofing, steel reinforced, and made it fire resistant, so nothing flammable. And this is the restored version. This was one of my last projects with CRSA, and it's now the Monson Center. It's part of the business incubator for the University of Utah. But it's pretty pure neoclassical revival, ionic columns, dentals, symmetrical. This is the carriage house or garage. By this time they had cars, and it's quarter round. And again, it's right behind the building, so these two blend together. Here are some of the exterior details. His kind of customized ionic column, his door designs, rondelles, brackets, Dart, corbels. This is the interior. This is in the Walrus Post. You can see the beautiful gold and white and kind of tan color scheme here, the classical color scheme. This is one of the offices, the cornice of an office. This is the cornice of another office. It's wonderfully deep. I think this prepared him for the Capitol later. Light fixtures compatible with the rest of the architecture. Now, this is a strange one, the auditorium or convention center. This was his elevation drawing. You can see all the ornament that was left off. You can also see how small these guys are here and how short and squatty this is. They left out the big bulwark panel. They left out this panel. They left out this dimension here with the balustrade. And all of this should have been about up in here, but probably for cost reasons, it was diminished from this facade to this rather pedestrian storefront. The Capitol, we get to the last of the buildings. The state capitol, the Capitol board hired Olmsted from New York, who designed Central Park and was probably the leading landscape architect in the country, to design a site plan, which he did. And then Kletting said, I can do that. I've done that lots of times. So he did his own site plan, and his was the one that was chosen. And ultimately, it was revised from this to this site plan, which was the one that was actually done. And he designed, when we worked on the Capitol, Roger and I worked on the two new buildings behind the House and Senate buildings. We did a historic structures report. We found a metal canister that had Kletting's 256 drawings, hand drawn for the Capitol. And in there were some fodder sketches that had these three buildings just dotted in. So they anticipated the expansion because government got bigger, but the building didn't get any bigger. So 20 years ago, these two were done, and now they're constructing this building here. This is a rendering, kind of an aerial view of the Capitol and the two House and Senate buildings, the reflecting pond, and the new building, and they anticipate maybe another reflecting pond. And this really is sort of a revival of Kletting's master plan. So these next slides sort of speak for themselves. This was Kletting's competition rendering, the first one. Actually, there's another one that's even fancier than this, with big statuary on all the corners of the building and across the top. And there was a lot more ornament. And from this rendering to this one, you can see that all of that has been stripped away because he had a man to do the whole building, $2 million. And he couldn't go beyond that. Now, here are the competition renderings from some of his there were 41 architects in this, and some of them were nationally renowned, Cass Gilbert and other names that you would recognize from back east. Tourtelette from Idaho. These guys here were local. Watkins, his former employee. And you can see what they were planning. They were all planning neoclassical buildings. Some were squattier, some were taller and thinner, but they were all versions of Greco-Roman classicism. This is the front elevation as it is now. This was done right after the building was completed in 1916, before any of the landscape went in. You can see how the site was. till some kids playing with matches blew it up, and it blew out all the windows in town, and they never found the kids. So monumentality, if you go back to those 8 criteria, this building meets every one of the criteria to the max. There's the east elevation, and at night, and it's a beacon. At night, it's a beacon to the city. I live 2 miles away, and I can see it clearly from my house. Nan lives on the west side; she can see it from her house, and some of you can see it too. When you look up State Street, you see this magnificent monumental structure at the head of it. I'm just going to let some of these slides speak for themselves. The interior. It was rated one of the 3 most beautiful capitals in the United States in a survey of capitals. And you can see why. Most of the other capitals, the floors on each level go all the way across. The Kletting has this great rotunda with this vaulted area that goes up 3.5 stories. And it brings the light from the skylight up above. Whereas Texas, which has the largest capitol, all the floors just go for the wall, and there's no openings or any vertical spaces like this. But just the detailing is spectacular. When I'm asked what are my favorite buildings in Utah, I say the Manti Temple and the state capitol when I'm talking about historic buildings. This is the gold room, and every square inch of it is thought out in detail. The restoration returned the original color schemes to the building. Some of the building major rooms, House and Senate, have been repainted in kind of Miami Vice pastel color schemes. Instead, we found there was aluminum, gold leaf, copper leaf, silver leaf, and the marble reefs. Some of these very exotic, strange things that you wonder about, what motivated those. This is an interesting story. These 2 eagles. This is a heraldic German eagle used by Hitler in his propaganda, and that's what Kletting initially chose for the building. And he was criticized for it, and there was sort of a racial connotation to it, even though he was a very loyal American and didn't like German government. So they replaced this eagle that was designed by him with this American eagle, kind of leaning forward, and it's very different, even though they're the same bird. Okay, so now we get to the end, and we maintain that Kletting was a Renaissance man. That's a bold assertion. And so I've included some definitions. In the 15th century, Albert said, a man who can do all things if he will. That was the term itself wasn't coined until 1906, but the concept has been around since 1500s. Da Vinci, basically a fully rounded person, someone knowledgeable in many areas, including the sciences, arts, and humanities. And then Webster says something similar, one gifted and skilled in many different areas, a highly cultivated man who is well-versed in many, or ideally, all the arts and sciences. So this is the last slide. And here are characteristics, here are things that Kletting was. And we can justify any one of them that we'd be interested in. Stone carver, he did his own illustrations, and art pieces, belonged to a sketch club. He did a lot of master planning, clearly an architect, pioneering reinforced concrete and steel truss design. He did all the engineering on his early projects, mechanical, electrical, civil, structural, all of it, did it himself. Bridge designer, canal designer, you can see down the rim, spoke a lot of languages, taught a lot of different math classes, all of that. He spent 30 years on the city planning commission. He was also a road commissioner. I'm not going to go over all of these, but he was an environmentalist. He started the Utah Forestry Association and several other groups. He was in charge of the Civic Planning Commission. He started his own publishing company. He started his own investment company. When the LDS Church in 1890 was committee, and they wouldn't allow the elected House and Senate members from Utah to be seated in Washington. Kletting was one of those who advocated the seating of Utah's elected officials and supported the church in terms of not having their property cheated or confiscated and allowing the political process to work. About 100 years ago, there was a contest. Everybody in the state was asked to nominate. There were 10 greatest Utahs. Not surprisingly to us, was that Kletting got a lot of votes for being one of the 10 greatest Utahs. There's a mountain peak named after him in the Uintas. There's a park named after him in the Avenue. He did 450 projects, about 38% are still intact. And in 1938, the AIA joined together with the Salt Lake Planning to name people as deans of Utah architecture. And they were Richard Kletting and Walter Webb. So there's our last statement. And if you're interested in learning more about Kletting and who he was and what he did and all the other kinds of projects, this is the book cover for our book. It's at the publisher now. It will be out in a couple of months. And this is clearly the capital of Kletting in his older years and some of his buildings on the back. So there you go. Questions? I think we have a Q&A scheduled.
After all that Kletting did, you mentioned one of his associates, Richard Watkins. Who were the other staff members? Because there had to be a myriad of other people working for him.
Chapter 21, I've written about all of his known employees. And there were maybe 35 of them. Watkins was the only one that ran a branch office and that only worked for part of a year. And then Watkins saw that he was like the dominant architect. So he left Kletting and then took over all the architectural work from Provo South and designed over 200 schools. And that was the end of Kletting's dominance in Utah County. But I can name a number of his employees, but the thing that's important is that one reason he was called the Dean of Utah Architects is because so many prominent architects were trained in his office and worked for him. And so they became great architects after him. Some of them ended up becoming his competitors, but like Leslie Hodgson, who did Ogden High School and the Ogden Municipal Building, the Forestry Building, worked for Kletting. And Scott and Welch, who did a lot of schools in the Masonic Temple, worked for Kletting. And I could name, 35 guys. So he really was the exemplar. Everybody wanted to work for his office. And it's interesting, in the obituaries of these other men, they mentioned working for Kletting. And I've looked at obituaries of other architects and they never mentioned who they worked for. It was a big prestigious thing to be in his office. Yes, Gary.
Will you allow me 2 questions?
2 questions from you, of course.
First of all, maybe you mentioned it, but I missed it at the outset. How did you decide
I should, I hope. Well, he and his brother came together. His brother was named Oscar. In fact, Nan, do you want to come up and also answer questions? In fact, why don't you answer that question? How did he get from Germany to Salt Lake City?
Okay, probably because Oscar came first. He came in 1880. He was escaping the military requirement in Germany. And when he did that, like many, if you've done your own genealogies, many times one person goes ahead to the new country, probably invited him to join him. He did come in 1883, and of course by ship. And the two of them settled in West. Various articles talk about them seeing development in different cities as they came along. When they stopped in Denver, they saw that there wasn't really much need for them. Denver was doing fine with the architects, but they heard that Salt Lake was up and coming. The railroad had just been, the passenger railroad had just been finished. They came to Salt Lake on one of the first passenger trains to Salt Lake and settled in. Both Oscar and Richard kind of settled into Salt Lake. And then Oscar eventually went up to Ogden and started a little bit of a career there. And then he went on to California eventually.
I think he knew that there was railroad architectural work to do in Salt Lake before he got here. That's my guess. But he came at a propitious time. Normally there are 2,900 population per architect. I don't know if you've heard statistics like that before. When he got here, there were very few architects. The older ones were dying off or retired. The ones who weren't were working for the LDS Church on the temple or other church-related projects. And so he was only 25, and Burton, who hired him, was 25. And yet they did that gigantic insane asylum in Provo. They did that gigantic Desert University, and they had all kinds of projects. They were loaded down with these huge projects as very young men. And so he came at a time when there was sort of a void or absence of great competition. But by 1890, when the Salt Lake building boom occurred, and it lasted from actually 88 to 93, when it ended at the financial panic that was countrywide, all of a sudden there were scores of architects here. If you look at directories, 20s, 30s, 40 architects, and no longer 2,900 population. There was only 20,000 people living in Salt Lake when he came here. But by 1890, the population had boomed, and he had so many competitors, and yet he outcompeted them for the most part. What's your second question?
Interesting that all the images shown here, we didn't see his home and or his office.
He had an office in many different locations throughout the downtown, and then he had his office in his home, and then he had a home next to his home that was his office, and none of them were classical at all. He didn't. His own home is a strange Victorian building that is not the equal of all the houses I showed you pictures of. It's very odd that he would design a house that wasn't as good as the one he designed for everybody else. But my dad was a carpenter and a builder, and he did that too. Okay, let's see. Yes, Paul.
We have a question from someone online. By the way, we had over 100 people on the Zoom call, so you have quite an audience here now. The question is, what do you think was his most significant work influenced by classicism, but it didn't necessarily appear to be classical in style?
Certainly the territorial insane asylum, the design was started by his employee and then the architect before that, so it wouldn't be that one. It could be the territorial fair building. That's possible, even though it was a short-lived building. It was not neoclassical at all, and yet classical in principle. I saw another one out there somewhere. It's gone. Okay.
Did he have any association with the county?
That's a great question. Well, what happened is that there were political parties that were strongly fighting each other when it was decided to do a city and county building. They were originally going to do it closer to South Temple, further up north. And they hired this Italian-American architect named Pony from another state, and he claimed he had all this experience that he could do the project. So he designed it, but it turned out that he was not competent and he was erratic. Kletting, why don't you come and revise the pony's drawings? And by then they decided to have it on Washington Square where it is now, the historic one. And so he did some designs and he struggled with the contract. He was determined to always get completely paid for what he did. He was involved in many lawsuits, mainly for not getting paid. And there's only one lawsuit I know that was against him, and that was by Scott, who worked on the Capitol, who complained he didn't get paid double time for working overtime. Anyway, he won those other suits, but then all the other architects in town complained that there was not a competition. It was direct awarded, and so they decided to have a competition. And part of the contract was that the building couldn't cost more than $300,000, or the architect would have to essentially forfeit his fee and make up the difference. Well, that wasn't very attractive. And as it turned out, they hired Mannheim, the local architect who also co-designed this building, and Proudfoot and Bird from Kansas. Mannheim, Proudfoot and Bird did the building, but it cost over $900,000. It was 3 times more. 300% higher than the budget. And so Kletting dodged a bullet because he decided not to compete. He withdrew. But I think what he learned there helped him on the capital competition, where he was going up against 40 other architects. And there were a lot of issues there too, which we won't get into right now. Yes, in the back.
How he got together with Chicago School and his architecture and where that
Can you talk about that? Okay.
Kletting made many, many trips back east to not only observe what was happening, but also to see what kind of development was happening in different cities. Chicago was one of those. And during the Columbian Exposition, he probably made acquaintance at that time, if not before, on one of his previous trips. And so he was getting influence not only from the buildings on the exposition itself, but from the city. And of course, looking at some of the places that he stayed, the hotels, for instance, you could see that he was making his way around town and probably visiting those architects at that point.
Dooley was invested around the country, and he, I think, had investments with people in Chicago, and I think he probably knew about Adler and Sullivan as well. But the White City Columbian Exposition, this was a World's Fair, basically, 1892. And if you read the book, The Devil in the White City, Daniel Burnham and, Make No Small Plans, all of the buildings, including the Utah one, were neoclassical. And the modernist architects like Frank Lloyd Wright despised that whole project. They wanted more modern buildings. It's a very interesting situation. Yeah, in the back. Yeah, yes, you, yes.
This is the first one here, is there any kind of museum section, museum memorial dedicated to Scott at all? Because he seems to be an important figure that is just not really about.
You're talking about Scott? I can't quite hear you. Why don't you stand up and say it louder?
Mr. Kletting, he seems less known inside his degree. He seems to be pretty important. So, is there any kind of museum section dedicated or something like that?
At the Capitol, do you want to speak to that? Since you're a docent at the Capitol?
Actually, we have some other docents here, I noticed, and some fabulous employees who overlook me as well. So really probably the best known things about Kletting revolve around the Capitol. And when tours are given, they kind of focus on his design had, especially coming from Europe, and some of those buildings that he incorporated ideas, the translucent floors, the skylighting, the use of light within the building itself. And so if you go to the Capitol, actually come and take a tour, because we do really focus on his career. And of course, that being his last, I would say his swan song, certainly not the last thing he designed, but his swan song.
If you drive up to the UNS and look, you find Kletting Peak, there's a big stone monument about the size of this lectern with a big bronze plaque on it that talks about his work as an environmentalist and a naturalist and forestry and water conservation and so forth. So there's that. And Kletting Park is on B Street, where Kletting House used to be, ironically. And there's a plaque there as well. And if you Google Kletting, you'll find lots of sites that talk about him, including the Utah Center for Architecture, which is sponsored by the AIA. They collect information about Utah's historic architects, and of course they have a lot of information on Kletting. He was also written up in encyclopedias. Part of our deep research is benefited from two websites, UtahDigitalNewspapers.com and a similar one. And so we put in the word Kletting, and I think we found 3,000 newspaper references to Kletting from 1883 to 1943 when he was killed, and even after that. So you say he's not well known, and the general public probably never heard of him. If you're part of the architectural and architectural history community, you know about him, but nobody has researched him to the extent that we have.
Related to this question, is there any archive of drawings, or were they all lost?
When he died, his second wife, he was divorced from the first wife, she contacted his clients and asked them if they wanted his drawings. He had this house next door, and then he had this two-story carriage house. So he had plenty, in fact, he had houses on both sides of his main house. He had lots of places to store drawings, but fires took out a lot of them. But she offered them, and then the rest of them, I think, were destroyed. However, some of them have survived. I have a set of drawings for the Smith House he did in Draper, a nice set of 10 sheets of drawings. And the U of U, Western Americana, up on the 4th floor, they have drawings of the Felt Building, Ensign School, and the Federation of Labor Building. Those three buildings, they have Kletting working drawings. But I've also seen drawings of the Riverton Meeting House, and some owners I've seen have drawings. So there are some around. There's not any archive that has the bulk of his drawings, and there aren't that many.
They have that, yeah.
Oh yeah, the beer house on B Street that's still standing. There are drawings of that one too. Yes, over here.
Allegedly designs furniture for as well as that can be found.
Yeah, he was an interior architect, and in his early business cards, he specialized in renovation, remodeling, rehabilitation, that kind of thing. But I don't know of him designing furniture. Frank Lloyd Wright designed a lot of furniture, and he must not have liked people, because if you sat on it for more than about 5 minutes, you'd want to get up and leave. You know, it's just 90-degree hardwood stuff. So I don't know of Kletting designing furniture, but it wouldn't surprise me, because he designed the windows, and he designed the landscapes, and he designed so many things. So it wouldn't surprise me, but I've never heard of that. There's a master's thesis by a guy named Craig Bybee that talks about Kletting, and it's out of date. It was written about close to 50 years ago, and he didn't have the advantage of internet research and things like we do now. But we went through all the Salt Lake City building permits from 89 is when they start, up until his death, and researched all of the Kletting buildings and the building permits, and then newspaper articles and so forth. And I've never heard that he designed furniture. Woman in the back.
I couldn't see it, but it's very people and he was so much classical moment. If he was accidentally, I doubt it was accidental, but I wonder if it was an aesthetic choice or some knowledge.
I didn't quite hear all of that. Could you like state that about 8 words?
So it's like entire site plan, like the capital.
Yes.
It's like spiritual. And it goes back to like Egyptian design and symbolism with that. I'm not afraid if that was an aesthetic choice or if it's a symbolic choice or if it's just accidental.
I don't think anything he did was accidental. I think everything was intentional, and he battled with the Capitol Building Committee on everything, including the site plan. And when the Capitol was restored, part of the project was to build a plinth or platform around it of granite, which is there now, which was not there before the restoration, and it did show up in his drawings, but then it never was built, probably for cost reasons. In terms of symbolism or Egyptian, I don't know about that. I think ultimately he did something that was going back to Vitruvius, strong, utilitarian, and beautiful, functional. I think that was the reasoning. He had the site regraded. He had extra property purchased because the site wasn't big enough. He did a lot of stuff even before the site plan to try to get the site even a candidate for all the stuff that needed to go on there. I know it was very intentional. Yes, yes.
Specs for design and classical design proportions, and architects at that time to fast forward to today, developers and what they're doing today in Salt Lake City, what we went wrong.
Well, I agree with you. I look at all the new apartment buildings and I think to myself, did they never hear of the golden ratio? Did they never have a class in proportions or a compatible mix of materials? When you have a building that has, metal siding next to wood siding, next to plaster, next to something else with 6 different colors and 4 different materials, all in a skitty-wumpus form, it makes no sense to me. I don't know what's going on in the architecture schools right now to produce people who think that's good architecture. So I think even his new buildings, and we didn't show you, he did some modern buildings that are quite wonderful, but not part of this lecture. So I think he was a master of proportion and symmetry and those other classical principles, even in his modern buildings. I don't see much of that today. I'm talking about apartment buildings, but there are homes, there are other kinds of libraries. There are some nice modern buildings. I mean, I love a really well-designed modern building. I just don't see enough of them. Okay, that question killed it. It just, I don't want to go too negative here. So thank you very much.
So did I characterize Alan's genius appropriately at the start? We're so lucky to have him, and thank you so much for coming. We have about 90 people here and 100 online, so it's really great. If you are interested in AIA credits, you've got to put your name on that number. And you good folks online, you got to email Alyssa Felix your AIA number if you care. So thanks again to Micah for hosting us here. Thanks again to Alan. There's still a lot of food left, so come and grab something anyway.
Is there any way I can get a picture of, was it Fran?